So do you go to IEP meetings and find yourself struggling to help teachers understand how your child can be included in general education when they're actually performing at a much lower level than the other kids in the class? Or do you find yourself having trouble trying to give exact examples of what inclusion can look like in the general ed classroom? If those are questions that you've had, you are in the perfect place because we've got the perfect guest for our show today, Shelley Moore. And I don't even really remember how I stumbled upon this wonderful video that she did on YouTube, and she was a TEDx speaker. She is just a fascinating storyteller. And so I thought when we start our show today, it would be a great foundation if we watch this 3-minute video that Shelley made about transforming inclusion. So I'm going to share my screen and pull up Shelley's YouTube video, and then we will start our show off.
As Canadians, we have a reputation for finding and embracing value, however, hasn't been reflected in our classrooms, which still segregates students, especially student development of this gap in our understanding philosophically, importance of understanding our practice. This is the question I'm trying to answer in my research. How can we find the value in the day-to-day practice classrooms in terms of inclusive? How am I going to explain this to you? Now, I can sit here and try and describe this, or we could have a little bit more fun. Why don't we go bowling? So let's talk about bowling. You have 10 pins, you have 2 balls, and you have a lane. Goal is to knock down as many pins as you can. But if you don't get them all, it's okay because you have another chance. But when I bowl and roll the ball down the middle and I don't knock them all down, what often ends up happening to me is that there's 2 pins left standing on either end, and they stare at you. It's the 7-10 split, and it's the hardest shot in bowling. How is bowling like teaching? Ball is the lesson, the pins are the kids. We aim for the middle the best we can. Pins that are left standing, we often have another chance to kind of get to them, but at the end of the day, 2 pins that are staring, looking at you, are kids who need the most support, are kids who need the most challenge. We end up choosing one, the other one is left standing. I just took all the fun out of bowling. Now, I don't know how many times you've watched professional bowling, but I spent an afternoon watching professional bowling, and let me tell you, there was not one bowler who rolled that ball down the middle of the lane. They threw the ball down the lane at a curve. I was actually really curious about this, so I called up a professional bowler. He was so excited. I don't think he gets a lot of calls about education. He said the reason why the ball has to enter at a curve is because you will knock down more pins and create a bigger domino effect if you enter at that angle. But in order to do that, you have to change your aim. In order to knock down the most pins with one shot, he aims for the pins that are the hardest. Now let's just let this sink in for a second. We are taught to teach the head pins. We are not taught to teach to the kids for the furthest and the hardest to get. Autism, Down syndrome. The part that's critical here, and it really aligns with universal, that so often supports that we design for those kids on the outside of the lane are actually supports that all of the kids. This is the part we need to understand. How can we find this value of diversity in our classrooms? This is not just important for the outside pin. Every single one of them. And just think, all we need to do is change. Look how bowling changed education.
So I love the metaphor that Shelley has used with how we can look at bowling and how our, oops, I think my video is still going on here. But how we can use that metaphor.
Friends.
And
I need to pull myself together.
So I don't know.
Next video.
I know. Let me share my screen again.
So yes, I decided that I wanted to do So
Yeah,
I
I'm
did,
supposed to.
and I panicked people,
Oh dear.
and everyone's video.
It's my next video on there.
I know. It's
I was
like
really thinking
I
about
gotta
this
shut down.
for that.
I've got to.
This was because I just made this.
It's a runaway video.
YouTube does that.
It connects to me because I think that if there's something that I can.
Okay.
Can you find the YouTube?
I know. I'm trying to find
This
my.
is something that. If I were to attach a word.
Here I am.
Okay, there we go. Sorry.
Shelley, be quiet.
I know. It's like, what's the deal? So I think that was just a commercial that you can go to YouTube and find more of Shelley on YouTube, right? But I wanted to just give you a little bit of information for Shelley's background, and then she can share some more about herself. But she's been a teacher in New York. She has been living in British Columbia, Canada for quite a number of years. She is a wonderful storyteller, as you can tell from her videos. She's also the author of a #1 best-selling book, which is called One Without the Other, Stories of Unity Through Diversity and Inclusion. And if you type yes in the comments, I will let you be entered into a contest to see who our lucky winner is, and we'll get a free copy of Shelley's book. So I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a retired teacher, a parent, an advocate, and I do weekly Facebook Live shows, and I am thrilled that we have Shelley Moore with us. Some of you have just heard her last month in Denver when she was talking at the Peak Parent Inclusion Conference. And I told Shelley she's got groupies that are following her and that want to kind of keep learning from her. So welcome, Shelley, and I'll let you take it away.
Hello, Charmaine. Thank you for having me.
Yes.
This is perfect. I've never done a Facebook Live show before, so this is all new for me.
Well, it'll be fun.
Okay, so how should we start? Where should we start?
So, I don't know if you want to give any more about your background. I know you have some visuals that you're going to share. I thought it would be helpful. The past few weeks, we have been talking about, universal design for learning. And I know that that is something that is really critical that you embed in what you help teachers do every day in the classroom. And then also just the concept of inclusion, because I think so many people kind of see that in different ways. And what I get from parents a lot and teachers at IEP meetings is, what does this really look like in practice? So, I think we can go, and I think our plan is that you'll be able to present information, and our last 15 minutes we'll use for some questions and answers from our viewers.
That sounds perfect. Okay, well, I guess I'll start a little bit about me. So I'm Shelley, and I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So if you're a hockey fan, you know that Edmonton is a very important place in the hockey world. And so I grew up in Alberta, and I had a hard time in school. I didn't really fit into the school box. And, if you grew up in the 80s, you know that school looked a lot different than it's trying to look today. And I think we have way more opportunities now for a little bit broader range of diversity and inclusion than we did before. And so I think it's a really exciting time, but also with change comes a lot of stress because we didn't grow up this way. And so, we're trying to do things that sometimes we don't know what it looks like, but we know why it's important. And so this is kind of the struggle, is that we get it, we understand why inclusion is important, but we don't sometimes have the actual practical vision of what that means. And so this is a conversation that's happening, I think, all over North America, to be like, okay, I get it, yay inclusion, yay diversity, but how do I make a grade 10 science class meaningful for someone who's going to be a doctor, but also someone who has a cognitive disability? And so it's a very practical question, and I'm so excited that people are asking it, because it means that they're starting to play around with some of the conditions that we never thought were flexible for generations. And so it's exciting, but I can totally appreciate that it's cognitive dissonance for a lot of us, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. So I guess The bullying metaphor was a really significant day to me, and I can't even believe how much it's taken off. I get emails from people all around the world who have seen
Yeah.
that. So it's amazing to track its path. But when I oh that specific metaphor around bowling, I was teaching a course at Simon Fraser University, which is our local university in Vancouver here, one of them. And one of my students actually, I was teaching a course around kind of adaptations and modifications, and one of my students, who's a teacher, brought in a Peanuts comic, like Charles Schultz,
Uh-huh.
and it was Charlie Brown and Lucy, and they were having a conversation. And my student brought this comic, and the comic says, like, so Charlie Brown says, Lucy, my teacher says bowling is like teaching, or teaching is like bowling, and then Lucy says, well, she must be a horrible bowler then. And I was like, okay, but I was thinking about that, because of course we all laughed, right? But I was thinking about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, the comic is actually incorrect, right? Like even the comic, even the person who made that comic, Charles Schultz or otherwise, assumed that the teacher was rolling down the middle, right? And so here's the little secret: is I was in a bowling league when I was 10 years old, and so like it kind of like I was just like, wait a second, that's funny, but it also doesn't make sense because that's not how bowlers bowl. They don't bowl down the middle. And so I started kind of thinking about this a little bit more, and then evolved well, let's kind of think about this comic the right way. What if bowling was like teaching, but we think about it in terms of a curveball instead of right down the middle? And so then it just kind of grew from there, and has turned into just, something that kind of represents so much of what we do in education, because we're not just aiming for head pins anymore. We don't just have head pins anymore, but we have this, beautiful range of diversity. And how do we actually get it? Well, it's not more work, but it is different work, and that kind of represents the changing of the aim. Because I really believe it's easier. I really believe that, teaching to diversity is easier, but it's a shift in paradigm that is different than what we're used to.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that, and it is so true. I think sometimes parents feel like, they remember the days when they were in school and the teacher kind of taught for the average, student, which
Yeah.
we know doesn't really exist. And
Mhm.
so now parents are like, what? Like my kid could really be learning academics
Mhm.
in a general ed classroom? And so for parents, it's kind of a disbelief. And then for teachers, it's like, well, what's the practical aspects of how this really
Right.
happens?
No, absolutely. And I think parents, I think, are our strongest advocates. Well, they are absolutely the strongest advocates out there, but they have like multiple lenses for these kids. Like parents are the biggest cheerleaders, but it's because they see the abilities, right? And so I think, and parents aren't trapped within standardization of curriculum. And parents don't look at their kids and be like, I love you all equally, but you better. You know what I mean? Like we don't rank our kids. And so I think, we have this incredible advocacy coming from parents, which is why this is moving. And then we have teachers who sometimes don't get the support for how to actually make this happen. And so it's a conversation that's happening because, I really believe that teachers are creative, you know what I mean? And they believe in this, but part of it is, they need to see what's possible so they can take it and they can run, and so this is part of it. It's like, what does this look like? What are the different roles that students can take in a classroom, and but also not forgetting that, you know, everybody can also learn, right? Like it's because when inclusion really started, the push was really for social inclusion, which is absolutely important. But I think that the kids we're talking about have more capabilities than that too. And so, how do you also get their intellectual purpose within these classrooms, regardless of the ability levels or the age levels, right? So that's kind of my research is that work is how do you kind of close the intellectual gap in secondary schools, because that's where the biggest question is. And I figure if you can make it happen in a grade 12 classroom, you can make it happen in a grade 2 classroom, because it's a smaller gap, not a bigger one. And so the work that I'm doing is really exciting because I think it's really needed.
Oh, for sure. And I think too, when I look at your research for the secondary level, then to me, the next step is looking at post-secondary opportunities for
Absolutely,
students,
absolutely.
you know, and in Idaho, we're just starting to work on that, and I know other states have been, have more opportunities available. But yeah, so your research, I think, is going to help all levels and all ages of students. And so that's really exciting. I think too, when I look at, students being included in classrooms and having that expectation and that presumption that they are competent, that they are going to be learning, is such a critical kind of attitude for us to have, both as parents and educators,
Yeah, and I think one of the first questions I get for people who are struggling with this, and I think they mean it in an honest way. Like, I don't think they're meaning to be disrespectful. Is that people will be like, well, but why are they here? Like, what are these kids going to get out of this? Like, they're not going to become physicists. They're not going to become doctors. And I'm like, and part of me, and I have said this, I will fully admit, is that like, what does anyone have to get out of this? Like, why is this? I mean, I hate to break it to you, but of all the students you ever teach, you might get 2 or 3 doctors. Like, we're not teaching to the doctors. Like, why is this important curriculum for anyone? Like, and so I think that part of this is we forget that part of the role of public education is to expose kids to interests, right? To find out what their strengths are, so that that can follow through them in the world, whether they become a manager or work in food service or become an astronaut. Like, it doesn't actually matter. And I was actually supporting a science class, and they were learning about the periodic table of elements, and there was a little guy with Down syndrome in there, and the teacher just looks at me and he's like, I don't know what to do. Like, how do you make this meaningful for someone who has a cognitive disability? And I'm like, okay, well, why do we need to learn about the periodic table of elements? Like, anybody. And he looks at me and he's like, because the world is organized. And I'm like, that's exactly why. And when you can find a big idea like that, it transcends age and ability, right? Like, I mean, I wish I had known that when I was in grade 10 trying to learn about the periodic table of elements. It's not about memory. It's not about these micro skills, but there's big ideas in everything we do and everything we teach. Which is the bridge, right? Because whether you have Down syndrome, or whether you're 5 years old, or whether you're 10 years old, or whether you're going to be an astronaut, or whether you're 17 or 99, like, it doesn't matter your age or ability. That big idea is relevant to everybody. And what ended up happening was the student in this class ended up finding the periodic table of elements fascinating because he loved science, and we made it very tangible, and we made it very, very like, we found objects around the elements. And at the end of the term, the teacher's like, I hate to admit this, but I think that the student we were talking about was probably the most engaged out of everybody else, right? Like, like, when you think about you want to teach these courses so kids are interested, he's like, he was the most interested in what we were doing, and so he almost became a model for the other kids to how to engage in science. And, I see these examples over and over again of, kids coming to high school, and they still love Blue's Clues, and they still love, children's books and Fisher-Price pianos. And I'm like, I can understand that maybe that matches their developmental level, but it doesn't match their age level. And so, like, is there a way that we can make age-appropriate content also developmentally appropriate? Because every time we've tried to do that in curricular classrooms, making age-appropriate content developmentally appropriate, like, they drop the Blue's Clues like no tomorrow, because it's just they haven't been exposed to anything else, right? And so I think that this is kind of the pattern that I think about, is how do we take these very complex ideas, make them bigger, because the bigger you make them, the more accessible they are. But it's not making it simpler. It's not about making it easier. It's making it more relevant, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's, that definitely is one of those principles of universal design for learning, as far as the engagement and keeping kids motivated. Absolutely. And all kids, I think, want, a lot of times, want to know the why. Why are we learning this? How am I going to use this? And so I love, I've looked at, like, different formats that you use for teaching teachers with lesson plans, and looking at those essential questions, those big ideas, and what you want all the students in the class to learn, what some of the students will be
Yeah,
doing.
yeah.
And then a few students will be
You know what?
learning.
That's so funny. I have a visual on that. Let's just look at it.
Well, good.
So the framework that Charmaine is talking about is actually a really established research-based strategy called the planning pyramid. And I'm just going to share it because, you know, I learned about this late or kind of like mid-career, and it really changed my life in terms of not just education, but I mean, I plan my dinner parties this way now, you know, and because basically what it is it's making kind of our standard, like it's still standard based, but it kind of just stretches it to make a bigger window. And so this is the framework that Charmaine was referring to, and it's from the 90s, and you know I am totally like I'm bringing it back because it is so good. And basically it says, you know, rather than starting with the most complex concept or idea or skill or piece of knowledge and then trying to go backwards, why don't we start from what's essential? And so this really looks at those essential understandings. Because I like metaphors, my favorite way to think about this is I like to kind of compare this to a baked potato. And I think about, like, if I was a teacher and I'm teaching a course and I have 30 kids in my class and my course is about baked potatoes. So I'm going to prep and I'm going to make 30 fully loaded baked potatoes, and everybody gets them. And I'm like, yes, I am so good at making baked potatoes. I have a passion for baked potatoes. Don't worry, this is going somewhere, I promise. But then we realize that maybe like 3 or 4 of the kids can't have dairy. And then we realize that some of the kids don't eat meat. And so we have to kind of think, well, how are we going to take the butter off? How are we going to take the bacon bits off? And so that's where like we're like, well, I'm going to need a para or an EA to come in and take the bacon bits off. And then I'm going to need another assistant to come and take off the melted butter. And so it also talks about how we're using our assistants to be like, they're basically retrofitting what we're doing, as opposed to being like, well, wait a second. You know, at the end of the day, there's maybe only a handful of kids that can actually eat a fully loaded baked potato, you know? And so rather than kind of assuming that everyone can eat every part of the potato, why don't we think about, well, what can all kids eat? Right? And so be like, what would be just the potato? What would be the potato that everyone can eat? You know what? And you know what? Sometimes that's enough for kids, right? But they're in. But you know what? Some kids need more, and so we're gonna make sure that there's options to add on more toppings. And you know, everyone's taught everything, but it's really also allowing kids a little bit more autonomy and agency to decide, help them to decide how much more challenge that they want, because you know, the goal, sometimes we lose track of the goal. The goal is not to eat a fully loaded baked potato. The goal is to eat, right? And to make sure that everyone has enough. And so then our assistants can, rather than, you know, picking off the bacon bits or trying to take away pieces in that deficit framework, it's really thinking about, okay, well, what if our paras and our assistants are there for everybody to say, let's make sure everyone's eating. Let's make sure everyone's making the right decisions for how many toppings and what types of toppings they put on. Because then it's about, the goal is about growth as opposed to this really narrow definition of proficiency. Because, you know, the reality is, based on the diversity of just the world, is, you know, the standards that are being formed are, first of all, written by a very narrow population, but also, you know, the expectation, you can be the best teacher in the world and have all the supports and all the funding and the best school, but the reality is there's a lot of kids that can't get to proficiency and a lot of kids that could go way further than proficiency. And so we're actually teaching such a narrow band of society. And so what I like about this framework is it takes that band, because I still believe in standard, right? But it just widens it a bit so that, you know, more kids can fit within what that means. And if you widen it enough, everybody can fit, you know, and that's the work and that's the practice. And so the other kind of way that I think about this is the rocker ring. Do you guys have this in America, the rocker ring?
Yes.
So if you haven't played with the rocker ring before, the yellow post is tapered, so the order of the rings matter, right? And so Charmaine, you're gonna help me out. So if you wanted all the rings to fit, which ring do you have to start with?
The red one.
Red one. So the red one's the biggest, right? So you put the red one on. It's the easiest to put on, but it's also the most stable, right? So if you put the red one on, then you can add the
orange one.
And then the
yellow.
You got it. And if we keep going, then we can add all the way to
purple.
Purple, good. So the purple one is the most difficult to put on. It's the smallest. You have to be the most accurate. But it's also the least stable. So if we just put that on with nothing underneath it, it'll just pop right off, right? So the rest of the rings actually anchor the most complex ring. And I think this is a misunderstanding. And the reason why this is different than differentiation is because if we thought about this rocker ring as different levels of ability in our classroom, it's not that we're streaming kids by color, but that we're using each other's strengths to provide the foundation for the whole class. And so this is part of it. So we need the kids who are red as much as we need the kids who are purple, because the red ring is the biggest ring. It's the big idea. It's the connection to life in the world. And if we can figure that out, it's going to be the foundation for everybody on top of it. And so this is a different way of thinking about classrooms, because I know when I got trained in a diverse classroom, it was to kind of create ability groupings. But I mean, you can stream by eyelash length if you really wanted to. We're running out of kids and we're running out of places. And so kind of the switch on that is, well, wait a second, what if the diversity actually helps us teach and each other? And so this is similar to the rocker ring, right? So you have your goal for all, and then you add on more goals, right? But if you start in the middle, if you teach to the middle and you start in the middle, you can always add on complexity, but you can't go back and force on the rings after the fact. So this also really talks about, where we start our teaching. We have to start from access as opposed to starting from challenge, because every time you try and go backwards, it's a deficit, and kids will always show behavior over looking like they can't do something. And so this is a really important metaphor, and I have this as a keychain to remind me of things, because we think about, like, how do we add this on. This also kind of talks about our kids, with cognitive disabilities, where they kind of can fit into this framework. And I think about them as kind of, what's an access point that they need to have access to the curriculum. So rather than doing something different, rather than having kind of a parallel activity but not a connected activity, like, this is a really connected activity, because exactly like you say, like, whatever this access point is, it's not just for them. It's going to help 10 other kids that aren't on a caseload. It's going to help the other kids who maybe just need a little bit of reminder because they have a gap in knowledge. And it's going to help the kids, because there's so much research to say that kids will hold on to new information if they can connect it to prior knowledge, right? Like, this becomes prior knowledge for everybody else. So it's a strategy that's really important to reach this diversity, but it's really shifting away from, it's not the diversity that's the problem, it's the design. On the other end of the spectrum, we can't forget about our other kids who need challenge. And so I think about them the exact same way. How can we kind of take the kind of that grade level goal and stretch it for them? But just like the access point, what makes this inclusive is that these are now goals for everybody. We're going to start together. Everyone has the opportunity to go as far as they want, but then kids kind of decide their level of challenge. So this is my favorite planning framework on the planet. I love it.
It's great. It's great. And I think I know when we were, developing IEP goals for my son, I would try to think about, like 6th grade, they did ancient history and talked about Egypt, and so I would say, what are the things that I remember about Egypt?
Yeah.
I remember about pyramids. I remember about mummies. And it's like those, to me, it's like these are the key concepts that I want Dylan to learn.
Yeah, the things you're going to remember in 10 years, 20 years. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
And it's like, so he's not going to get to the detail and the depth that everybody else is.
Yeah.
But, when he audited college classes, and he took an ancient history class because he loved Egypt from 6th grade.
It's so interesting. Absolutely.
So it's like those opportunities. I mean, if he had been in a special ed room, he would have been folding towels and counting plastic coins, and but the richness that happens in the general ed room cannot be duplicated elsewhere. And
I think I had a parent once actually who said something to me that really stood out to me. She said, because I was actually very pro inclusion, but we didn't know, and so it, like, where we like, the schools, how they're structured in the district that I work in is you kind of go K to 7, and then high school is grades 8 to 12, so there's no middle school. And so her son was very, very included for elementary, and then she had this, like, looming fear, right, that high school was going to be kind of like down the hallway in a wing kind of thing. And so she came in kind of with her back up, fair enough. And I was so young, and she came in and she's like, I want my kid included. I'm like, okay. She's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, great, I want him included too. She's like, I wasn't expecting that answer, But she kind of got a little teary, and then she said to me, she's like, the part of this that I just want people to know and parents to know is she's like, you have my kid for 5 years. I have my kid for the next 65 years. I can teach them how to do laundry. I can teach them how to make sandwiches. I can teach them money because that's what I do. I can't teach them how to read. I can't expose them to the science concepts that are rich in general education classrooms. I can't teach them about Vikings and mummies and all of these things that are historically interesting, right? Or about our country or about our leaders. And, she's like, please use this time for that because I can spend the rest of his life working on what it means to live in the community. And it always kind of stuck with me because I'm like, it's absolutely true. And, it doesn't say that there isn't a time and a place for explicit teaching. Like, absolutely. I think work experience is very important. I think there absolutely is a time and a place that kids maybe need some downtime, so it can look different for different kids, but I really do believe that, like, everybody should have the opportunity to have access to academics from K to 12, and not just functional, but, like, interesting, like interesting and content rich, because that is what's interesting in the world, and I think that's what drives our interests as adults as well, just like you said with your son.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think too, and I know I've read, different things that you've written as far as all students in the schools should have access to a variety of locations where they
Absolutely.
can get extra help. And so
Yeah.
for Dylan, it was like if he needs extra help, like maybe go to the library and work on
Mm-hmm.
some things,
Hmm.
because I want students to see that he's a capable person. He doesn't have to
Yeah.
go to the special ed room, but
Yeah.
and then other kids, if they need a break from the class, the
Yeah.
library is a nice quiet place you can go to,
Absolutely.
you
Absolutely.
know.
Yeah, and I
So,
think, and this is a huge misunderstanding, I think, in the world of inclusion, and it's kind of caused some contamination almost because it's like people think that inclusion has to be, every place all the time, as opposed to kind of increasing the places where inclusion can happen, because, for some kids, like, everything is too much. However, increasing the places that it does happen is absolutely, more important than just like kind of forcing people to go. And this concept of just sharing space has kind of taken inclusion south because people think that inclusion is just physically being together. But, like, you don't need me to tell you, like, for anyone, like, cognitively able or not, 90 minutes for a class with no purpose is a really long time, right? And so part of this is how do we increase the places where kids are, but really purposefully? And, and I think that leads to, like, we've been talking about intellectual purpose, but there's other purposes, and, so really thinking purposely about what are the places that kids have access to and making sure they have access to places, but then also to support them so that they're very purposefully included there and not just physically integrated. Because I think that's kind of contaminating the inclusion efforts a little bit. They're not supported, teachers aren't supported, and there's no purpose. They're just there, and that's never the goal, right? So I think it's strategic, it's important, and that's the work. Like, how do you make these places meaningful, not just for kids with disabilities, but all kids, and support that community as opposed to just these individuals kind of spread out along the school. If that kind of makes sense. So
right.
yeah, yeah,
And I know as a classroom teacher, what kinds of accommodations I would make for some of my students would,
mm-hmm.
in fact, help everybody. I mean, I had a
Yeah,
little girl in second grade that had a hearing impairment, and when I figured out we could turn on closed captions for the Reading
yeah,
Rainbow videos, and
yeah.
guess what? All of my second graders
Everybody, yeah,
can benefit from
absolutely,
practice reading the closed captions. And if
yeah.
Brianna hadn't been in my class, I don't know how long it would have taken me to think of something like that. So,
No, absolutely,
I try to share with teachers, you're not going to be changing things for this one student. It
yeah,
makes you a better teacher, and chances are there's a number of kids that also can use those same
yeah,
accommodations or whatever.
yeah. Charmaine, I'm going to show another slide
Oh, good.
because I think we're kind of starting to talk about supports,
Okay.
and that's something that's near and dear to my heart because I think for a long time we really tried to regulate supports, around, this is for you, this is for you, this is for you. And so part of our inclusive conversation is shifting this way of that we support kids. And so, because I like my metaphors, on the left hand side of your screen you'll see cupcakes, and so I kind of think about kind of that historical deficit kind of medical based model as, okay, well, send the kids to the cupcake, or give individual kids the cupcake that they need. And so you might have a speech and language cupcake, you might have an English language learner cupcake, you might have a numeracy cupcake, a literacy cupcake, a behavior cupcake. And so you give the kids all the cupcakes. But the thing that's tricky about that, though, is that there's a lot of kids who need cupcakes who aren't on a list, right? Like, if we only relied on designations, we wouldn't, we're missing a whole bunch of kids that could benefit from this. And as kind of we struggle with funding, our cupcakes get smaller, and sometimes kids eat from multiple cupcakes, and so we're kind of left with this mass group of kids that are like, but what about the rest of us? There's no crumbs for anyone else, right? And so, this is, I think, the struggle for a lot of teachers, and why we think that sending them away is the option, because the model of support has been, we'll send them to the cupcake, send them away, right? But I think, and when you only had 3 kids who needed support, that made sense. But now we're in classrooms where everybody needs support because the classes are more diverse. And so the alternative is, I will always advocate for more batter. Like, this is absolutely a funding question, but I do also think that we could use the batter better. There's way more effective and more efficient ways to use batter. And so the right-hand side, you'll see the alternative, which is the layered support cake of love. Which is this idea where, like, rather than sending kids to cupcakes, what if we thought about classrooms as every classroom gets a cake? And the layers of the cake are determined by the diversity of the class. So if you have students who are learning English, that's going to be a slice, or it's going to be a layer of the cake. If you have kids who are First Nations or need resource support or speech and language support, those are supports that are built into that classroom cake. But then if it's in the classroom, everybody gets a slice of that, right? You don't have to prove that you need it. And this is really the underlying universal design principle of what's good for one is good for all. And it's not cheating, and it's not, it's not like the real world. Like, no, this is just responsivity. And I think if we look at supports in our adult life, we see supports as efficient, and to make our life easier. I mean, we have backup cameras and, all of these things that we're not cheating at driving, but, in school we have this very, very weird attitude that you can't have that unless you need it, versus, wait a second, why don't we teach this to everybody and help kids actually decide if they need it or not? Because it's that agency that is connected so closely with the research around self-regulated learning and student agency and growth mindset, which we talk about all the time. But if we're making those decisions for the kids, they're never going to know what they need because other people are doing it for them. So I kind of think about our classrooms. What would your classroom support cake look like? And how what would be the layers? And the more diverse, the bigger the cake, as opposed to you all get the same. No. Like, your cake is determined by the kids that are there. And I think that this is also a model that shows, it's not just supporting individual students, but supporting a teacher to support our community. And it also kind of aligns with how do we better support our teachers to meet the needs of kids, because they're put in a tough situation when they have a classroom that has varying ability levels but no support to do it, right? And I'm not talking about people necessarily for support, but just the coaching and the mentoring and the resources and the technology and the time to plan and collaborate, like that will be critical to teaching these diverse classes, whether we're talking about language learning or culture or all of the things. But it's supporting a classroom as opposed to supporting individuals is the big idea,
Right. And I think you're right, that time element is so crucial as far as just time for teachers to reflect, and it's like we are so, and I once had somebody talk about, it's like a trial attorney. If they spend every waking moment in a courtroom, with a trial and not any time to research or prepare,
totally.
It's like, how effective are they going to be? So that collaboration time and the leadership from the administration to make that
huge,
a priority, in that peer modeling and coaching versus just a workshop. all of that
Yeah,
has
yeah.
an impact, you know.
And the
So,
districts that I work with that have those kind of professional development models, teachers are just blowing my mind every day. I was working with one school yesterday, and they just they as soon as like they get it, and sometimes it takes them a little bit longer, but once they get it, they just take off, right? And they're doing things that are just blowing my mind. And and I think but it needs support. And there was another school that I was in where they were starting to kind of create inclusion in high school for our kids with significant disabilities or cognitive disabilities. And the administration said, like, I know this is hard and I know we're going to need support for this. And so if you open your door, you're going to get more support. And so he said, every person who takes a student who has a cognitive disability will get an extra prep. And one teacher was like, I'll take 8, because, you're not just planning for that individual student. You now have a support to plan for everybody, right? And
right.
and I think, it is more, it's more cost effective, it's more time efficient, and I think at a systematic level, this is where the conversations in leadership positions in administration, if there was one thing I could do is to shake up leaders to say, this is not just for our kids with disabilities, because you're supporting teachers to support all kids better. And I think our kids who need the most support are actually just making it safe to ask those questions and making it almost giving people permission to ask for help, because it's okay that we don't know, kind of thing, as opposed to, historically teachers have been taught to be the expert. You need to know everything, right? And so we're playing with this paradigm. We're like, no, you don't have to be the expert anymore, but we do have an expertise to share. And so how can we start working together and supporting each other and giving the time to do that to teachers? Because where I see it happening, it's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
So we need to clone people like you, Shelley, so we can be everywhere.
Well, I'm very, very lucky because I've been invited to some pretty incredible communities that are doing some great work. And so I kind of feel like I'm just kind of like a bee. I'm buzzing around and capturing great examples and just kind of like sharing them out with people, because I think the more people see, the more people will see that it's possible, and they'll see the benefits to everybody. And I think, where inclusion is struggling, it's because people just don't know. And when people don't know, teachers are just like kids. Like, if there's fear there, it comes with resistance. And I can appreciate that. And so I think making it safe for teachers as much as it is making it safe for kids, safe to take risks and safe to not know what to do and safe to ask for help. And that's a different environment than how we were raised to be teachers, and so, and you're an educator, and also kind of bridging some of those silos that have existed between curriculum and special education that still are very strong, but to really look at this as a community. And we know that in other pieces, it takes a village, and so how do we make room for the village in our schools?
Right.
Yeah.
And I know we had one person, Lissa was talking about teacher prep, and I know we had talked
Yeah.
about this just quickly before we came on air, but she was saying, do you think teacher prep programs can do a better job of not perpetuating a difference between special ed and general ed?
Yeah. No, I totally, that's Alyssa. Is that Alyssa who's asked that?
Yeah, Lissa.
Alyssa, thank you so much, because you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of our teacher prep programs, and it is starting to change. But I mean, when I went through teacher college, it was you take your one disability course and it was a survey course. Like, this is what autism is and this is what Down syndrome is. Like, it really wasn't, there wasn't any course that taught me how to design curriculum and how to actually plan for diversity. And if we did get taught it, it was plan for the middle and then make accommodations for individuals. But it's no longer our classrooms. So there are some very, very progressive universities and colleges that are starting to make changes. But even within the universities, there's a dynasty of deficit, right? And being like, no, you have to do something different for those kids. And often our university professors aren't teachers, right? Which is another thing. And so, to really start to, like, one program, the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, they're actually doing teacher prep programs in schools so that they can actually start to see how these pedagogical practices look like in a diverse classroom that includes all kids, so that they can start thinking about, it's no longer that kids with autism are going to be down the hall. Like, they're in your classroom. Like, what does that mean and what does that look like? And it's really dealing with a lot of the unknown and the fear that's happening. But Alyssa, you are dead on, is how do we bring this more into our teacher prep programs? 100%, absolutely.
Right. And I know, different parents that I've talked with, and just a couple days ago, I was having
Mm.
a conversation with a mom, and it seems like we see a pattern of when kids are in kindergarten, first grade, maybe second grade, there's more allowance almost, and
Mm.
like, okay, your child can be included. And
Yeah.
then when we start getting to third grade in the United States, when standardized tests are coming, then
Mm.
teachers are like, I don't know, the gap is
Yeah.
larger. And,
Yeah.
I try to help, parents and
Mm.
teachers understand that being on the same in a level as so many other students
Yeah.
isn't a prerequisite for being
No.
included. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you have any, words that parents can use
Yeah.
and help,
Well, I
with
think,
that.
like standardized tests are very much an intellectual purpose, right? And so, like we talked about this before, is, even if kids are writing standardized tests, it's not just skills and knowledge anymore. Like they need to know the why, but it's the why that is the connector for our kids. And so if you have a student with Down syndrome in your class, it forces you to think about the why. And that's not just for them. Like teach everybody the why, and that's going to help the kids on the standardized test, and it's going to give access to curriculum for kids who have a disability. But the other part of that is that inclusion is not just intellectual purpose. Like there's three. Like there's I have a slide. Let me just show you the
Well,
slide.
there you go.
So, so when we talk about kind of purposes, there's three possible purposes that we can kind of plan for students in classrooms, and this is not just kids with disabilities. This is everybody, and that's this idea of any place that we're in, we're negotiating these things all the time. Like we have our personal purpose, which is really connected to how we exist. It's connected to behavior, but it's not compliance, right? Like this is about how do I manage myself. It's really connected to the regulation of our behavior and our emotions. And then we have our social purpose, and this is how we're interacting with our peers and our teachers and our support staff. And then we have the intellectual purpose, and a really purposeful, inclusive community incorporates all three of these. And so absolutely include an intellectual purpose and have that big idea. But there's going to be the time where kids are going to be moving on to more complex ideas. And I get that, right? But that's when the purpose shifts. And the people who are the best at this are the peers, because I see it all the time. We plan for the intellectual purpose, and then as the curriculum becomes more complex, the peers will be like, hey, Jonathan, you're in charge of the pictures now. Hey, Max, you're in charge of holding this. Like the kids automatically shift the purpose for them. This is actually a framework that is really, really helpful for parents. This is on my website. Can you guys see this okay? But it's
Yeah.
basically, it's a planner to kind of help these purposes and to align classrooms with individual planning, but in an aligned way as opposed to a parallel way. So on the left-hand side, you see these are the possible places or spaces where, so if you're in elementary school, this might be one classroom, but you can include the gym and the music room and the lunchroom and all the places. In a secondary school, these could be different classes, but there's a place where what is the class doing in this space? What is the class doing at the beginning of the day? What is the class doing in math? And it kind of breaks it up. This is similar to IEP matrices that we've seen in the past. But what I like about this one is that it actually breaks it down into the three purposes. And so you can be like, okay, so if the class is doing calendar, what does this look like behaviorally for our student? What does this look like socially for a student? What does this look like intellectually for a student? Because then if one isn't working, you can switch it. But it's anticipated, so you're never in a moment where you don't know what to do. And this is really saved. And so it's kind of sitting down even for an hour and saying, okay, I have a student in my class, who might need really to be taught multiple purposes. Let's sit down with the parents, let's sit down with the teacher, let's sit down with the support EA or the para, and even the student and say, like, when the class is doing this, what is this going to look like for an individual, right? But when it's connected to this, it's not about they're in the class but they're working on some activity in the corner, but this has to be connected in all three. And so it really kind of focuses on the balance of these purposes as opposed to what we used to do, which was if you have one, two, or three of these deficits, you have to leave to another place to work on it. And Charmaine, I don't know if you know Norman Kuntz. Do you know Norman
Oh,
Kuntz?
yes, yes,
We
yes.
all love Norman.
I
So Norman,
know.
yeah, Norman said to me once, he said, pulling a kid out to work on something in a different place is like pulling a kid out of the pool, teaching them how to swim in the parking lot, and then dropping them in the water, right? Like it's as soon as you change the place, you change the purpose. And so the more that we can incorporate these three purposes within their classroom community, we're targeting the kids who need it, but also 10 kids that we didn't know needed it who also do. And so this is kind of the other framework I think about is absolutely plan for the intellectual, which is around that big idea. But there's two other purposes here that we can also anticipate planning for, get supports around, and this is where our paras and our EAs are critical because this is that implementation plan. And then they also have direction. I think sometimes we put them in some unfair positions because we kind of expect them to modify things on the spot without a plan. This kind of says, what's the big picture plan? Like, we're not modifying every single possible thing that happens in a classroom, but what's the big picture? What's the big idea? What are we going to do during different places of the day? And I find with those kind of two plans, kids can have a lot of success in these classrooms, and not it just being about including someone who's different, but actually having a person who contributes to the community as a whole in both learning and social and behavior, because they become the models that, like I always tell teachers, if you have a bully, you need to go get someone with Down syndrome in your classroom because they will teach everybody kindness, right? Like they will teach you how to be kind. And, I think we underutilize our kids as contributions sometimes. Well,
exactly. Yeah, for sure. And I wanted to tell people that I have a couple slides I'll show at the end that has like your website and different things. And I know like your one module for curriculum for all.
Oh yes, yeah.
Like a great resource. So I'll show those near the end of our session today to make sure, and then people can go back and stop the video and get it. And I can also put the links in the description.
Okay.
But I wanted to remind people that if you would love a copy of Shelley's best-selling book, One Without the Other, just type the word yes in the comments, and you'll be entered into the contest, and we'll pick a lucky winner this weekend because I want to share the goodness. And if you already have Shelley's book and you're the lucky winner, you can share it with a teacher or share it with a friend. And I think that's going to be really helpful. So I was going to check and see. We have people from so many different states. So
wow.
It's so cool to see. And I know your quote that you gave from Norman, I know Selena is watching, and that's one of Selena's favorite quotes. And she got to see you. She's from Idaho, but she flew to Denver, and she got to see you. So
Denver was so fun.
So you'll have to give a shout out to Selena. And also Terry is on here. Terry lives in Colorado, and she was able to see you this February also. So that is wonderful. And we've got somebody from California watching, and Oregon, and so it's just like really fun. So if you guys have specific questions, this is a great time to type them in the comments, and then I'll relay those questions to Shelley. We've got about 10 minutes left of our time, and I would love to give people an opportunity. And if you're watching the replay and you have questions, still type them in the comments. And if I can't answer the question, I'll get in touch with Shelley, and we'll still come back and provide those answers for you. So even the replay viewers, we want you to feel connected to our conversation too. So I know one of the questions we had was about, when a student is like in elementary school and they're in a reading group and their reading level is much lower, what are some ways that can be productive time? It's not going to be, a direct instruction time necessarily, but what are, when you have teachers say, well, how are they going to benefit because they're reading on such a lower level?
And this is a question that I get a lot because there's a big shift right now moving from ability groupings in both reading and math to diverse groupings, because what happens is in reading especially, even kids have a higher input comprehension than they do an output demonstration, and that's for all kids, right? Like, this is the reason why we read to babies. We don't read to babies because we expect them to read back to us. We read to babies because eventually these are skills that they're going to be displaying, right? And so it's almost like a spiral of teaching, and so part of it is especially for reading instruction, is dividing the the input and the input of information and demonstration of information, because there's a lot of kids who can't demonstrate information right away, but it doesn't mean they don't benefit from the input. And so when I think about reading classes, a student can have a different role in that class, and just because they're not demonstrating doesn't mean they're not understanding. And I think that this has totally changed a lot of things, because, there's a lot of kids that maybe have a hard time communicating, but they don't have a hard time communicating when they don't want to be there, right? Like, all kids can communicate that, but we also don't use that the opposite to be like, maybe they're also communicating that they don't want to leave. Right? And so sometimes this might be listening to a story. Sometimes this might be being a part of a group and just hearing their peers talk about things and hearing each other. We can't assume that they're not getting anything out of it, but we can assume that they will tell us if they don't want to be there, right? And so I kind of hold on to those things. There was an article that I read from an adult with autism, and I wish I knew who wrote this. I'm going to have to do some research, but he said something that really stood out to me once, and he said, so he was a student with autism who didn't have an augmentative communication device until later in life. And so they just assumed that he couldn't demonstrate, he couldn't understand, which is what we're seeing is so not true. And so he got a device later in life, and one of the first things he said was, I wish my teachers gave me the right to not understand. And so I think, we don't know, like, and so I realized that my job as the teacher was less about deciding where they go and if they go, but given the opportunity to go and just trusting that they will tell me if they don't want to be there. Everyone knows everyone is very good at communicating no, but we don't pay attention to the yes sometimes, and sometimes that's more subtle. And what I found was, kids are listening, and things will come out of them months or years down the road, and I'm like, you were listening, and so I think, part of it is just allowing them access to literacy, but also in terms of kind of diverse groupings for literacy, it's really important to also realize that this is a practice that's shifting, not just for kids with disabilities, but for everybody. Like, because as soon as it's an ability grouping, we put a lid on it, right? Kids can't see what's coming. And especially for math, for example, we assume that it's linear, and so you can't do fractions until you know how to add, and you can't do multiplication until you know how to do this. But that's not even true anymore. And so we put these kids in these ability groupings, and then they get to high school and they've never seen a fraction. Right? They can see the fractions. And so I think of it more of as a spiral as opposed to a line, and just trusting, like, even if we can't see the demonstration of learning, it doesn't mean that learning is not happening. And even if I can't capture it, it doesn't mean it's not happening. But we also have to expose kids that are more challenging, because that is also how they learn. And that's how we all learn. We are exposed to things that are more difficult than what we can understand. And so it's the balance between that really explicit instruction, but also the exposure to more difficult concepts, and I think reading is a perfect example of that. Just listening to reading as a literacy activity.
Right. Oh, I agree. And I know there's a mom that I'm friends with in Ohio, and I know she was saying her frustration was, the IEP goal was to read these CVC words.
Right.
It's 80% mastery before we get on. And it's like, sometimes kids are like, are you kidding? I am so tired of these words. Give me something else.
Well, and I mean, we read not for sight words, we read for comprehension and understanding, and literacy is so rich. And I actually caught myself doing this once. Like, so often our IEPs make goals about kids' deficits, right? So, like, you can't memorize, so here's some goals on memory, and you can't read. So, and I think about, what if IEP goals were built on strengths, right? And thinking about, they may not be able to decode or memorize or have tricky or have stretches in those areas, but, what if they're great at listening? What if they're amazing storytellers? And thinking about literacy in terms of the big picture and the holistic framework of, maybe for them it's knowing pictures and be able to tell a story with pictures. Because you know what? Some kids will never decode, but it doesn't mean they can't read. And this is, there's many ways to read. And I think, that's where getting the parent input is so important, to be like, what do you value? What's important to you? Because at the end of the day, it's the family and the community and that individual that really matters. And sometimes it's not about prerequisite skills. It's about who they are and showing growth within their strengths, as opposed to always just working on what they can't do. Like in the physical world, if you have someone in a wheelchair, you're not going to be like, let's work on your walking, right? But in the intellectual world, we don't get that. We're like, oh, you can't do this, let's work on it, as opposed to, how do we change the environment to make this disability no longer disabling? And I think that that is something that all of us need to think about a little bit more in terms of kind of how do we support kids with disabilities. It's not about forcing them to work on things they can't do, but forcing the context to make those things not disabling anymore.
Oh, I totally, totally
Yeah.
agree. And I think, that is, I think a great probably point for us to kind of
Mhm.
pull all of this together.
Yeah.
And if we can think more about strengths-based, IEPs,
Yeah. Yeah.
strengths-based learning, and
Mhm.
teaching through interests and all of that, it makes such a difference for every child. And I think it's more exciting as teachers because you see those light bulb moments
Yeah.
popping,
Yeah.
and it like feeds you as a teacher that, yeah,
Mhm.
we're onto something here. So,
And I just think,
you know,
our kids with disabilities who are down hallways and wings right now are our most underutilized resource and support out there. And so, if you're a parent that's watching this and you're a teacher who's watching this and you don't have kids with disabilities, like I encourage you, like call your principal and be like, you know what, I want my kids to be in a
right.
diverse classroom because that is the world. We're not organized by ability in the world. And, I think even for our kids without disabilities, it's a disservice to them because they're going to have to negotiate all types of disabilities if they're going to be a CEO or a doctor. And I think there's a hashtag that goes around every fall that says, will you be the one that demands diversity? And, I think there's a myth that these kids take away, but it's so inaccurate. These kids are absolutely contributors to these classrooms, and
Oh,
that, yeah, like just like there's no question about it. Yeah.
yes. So since I said I was going to do this, I need to remember. Let me show some of the links. So this is, like I said, if you want a copy of her book to be the lucky winner, type yes in the comments. This is a wonderful resource that Shelley has on her website, and it takes you through different steps about inclusion and, practical tips that you can use. So, and I'll post this link in the description too, so it'll be a little bit easier for you to be able to access it. But let me see, I think I had. So this is your blog post. It must be so nice to have a last name like Moore.
I love my last name. It's so handy.
Really. So I encourage you to go over to her blog here. She's got a lot of rich articles that you can use as a parent. Teachers can use and have conversations going in faculties around the different buildings in our schools. And let me see, I didn't start at the beginning here. And so this is the link for the YouTube video that we showed at the very beginning. And again, I'll type that in the comments, but this is her Transforming Inclusive Education, and just the metaphor that she uses about bowling is like right on. I mean, it really, I think I love how you interpret metaphors because I think that makes that hook for people and they
Yeah.
can then understand it.
That's how I have to understand it. Otherwise, I'm like, what is all this? So,
Well, I want to thank you so much, Shelley, for carving out time to be with us. People are like beyond excited by the comments that they've been posting and people that are viewing now and our future replay viewers. So I want to thank you. And I don't know if you have any other closing words that you would
oh,
like to
well,
leave
just
us with.
no. Well, thanks for finding me, and thank you for everyone who's tuned in and who's gonna watch this because I think it's such an important conversation and it's one that's bigger than school. This is something that it's life, and if we think about how we want our kids, how to prepare our kids for life today, this is it. Like this is bigger. This is bigger than we think, and so I trust you all to be brave and to keep fighting, and I'm going to do the same, and I think that we're really making a difference.
Well, thank you so much. And I remind people that we'll be on again next Thursday, noon Mountain Time. So tune in and have a wonderful rest of your day. And we shall see everybody next week.
Bye!
Bye-bye.